Sudanese dictator Omar al-Bashir has been overthrown and arrested after almost 3 decades in power. Months of demonstrations intensified when the army took the side of the protesters. Bashir is also wanted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Darfur. Well, speaking on state TV this afternoon, the Defence Minister, Awad Ibn Auf, said the army had decided to oversee a 2-year transition period ahead of elections.
As Defence Minister, I declare the fall of the regime and the placing of its leader in a safe place following his arrest. I also declare the creation of a transitional military council, which will govern the country for 2 years. The 2015 constitution has been suspended. We will put in place a state of emergency for 3 months and a curfew for 1 month.
Well, Omar al-Bashir is now reportedly under house arrest. He himself seized power in a coup back in 1989. He went on to oversee a brutal crackdown on insurgents in Darfur, leading to international charges of genocide. Eventually, he was forced to allow the secession of the south of the country. Julia Kim has this report.
Born on the 1st of January 1944 in northern Sudan, Omar al-Bashir was the son of a farmer. He joined the Sudanese army at the age of 16 and quickly rose through the ranks. It was in the midst of civil war that al-Bashir seized power from Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi on the 30th of June 1989. As colonel, he was well placed to lead what was a bloodless military coup. 4 years later, Omar al-Bashir declared himself president. The Sudanese leader inherited a country torn by conflict on all sides. A civil war raged between Arab Muslim tribes in the north and Christian rebels in the south. And in 2004, an insurgency erupted in the western region of Darfur. Al-Bashir ordered the army to quell the revolt, but the UN also accused him of backing the Janjaweed, pro-government Arab militias that killed, raped and mutilated thousands of civilians. The Darfur conflict left about 300,000 people dead and some 3 million displaced. For his role, Omar al-Bashir became the first sitting head of state indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. He denied the charges.
Their goal is to stop development in Sudan. They're trying to distract us, to keep us distracted with their cases and their accusations, but we will not be distracted.
In 2005, the government signed a peace deal to end the civil war, leading to an independence referendum in 2011. The South Sudanese voted overwhelmingly to break away, and so, under Omar al-Bashir, the country split in two.
Our relationship with the newborn state in the south will be based on respecting the pledges and on maintaining the deep-rooted emotional links between us and our brothers in the south.
The resulting loss of 3/4 of its oil revenue crippled the Sudanese economy, ultimately spelling the downfall of his government.
Well, the Sudanese protests began initially because of a hike in bread prices. 4 months later, Bashir is gone, but demonstrators are wary of his number 2. The Defence Minister saying that the army should now oversee a transition period, something that the demonstrators are opposed to. Ivana Skatola has this report.
Protesters first took to the streets on December 19th, angry at the government's decision to triple the price of bread. They spread to Khartoum and other cities a day later, with demonstrators calling for freedom and the fall of the regime. Clashes broke out as police tried to disperse the crowd, and several were killed. On December 24th, after 6 days of demonstrations, President Omar al-Bashir broke his silence and vowed to introduce reforms. But protests continued into January. Al-Bashir announced he was ready to step down, but only through elections.
I confirm that whoever wants to take over power is welcome, but only through one way, which is the ballot boxes, free and fair elections. Whoever rules Sudan has to be chosen by the Sudanese people.
But protests continued. Human Rights Watch released videos documenting violence by security forces, including live fire and beatings, accusing authorities of a brutal crackdown. On February 22nd, al-Bashir declared a nationwide year-long state of emergency and dissolved the federal and provincial governments. 3 weeks later, a new cabinet of his loyal supporters was sworn in. Protests, though, intensified at the beginning of April. On Saturday, thousands marched in Khartoum, calling for the army to join them and back their demands. Things turned violent on Tuesday as security agents tried to disband the mass sit-in outside the army headquarters. But after 4 months of mass demonstrations, protesters finally got what they wanted.
As Defense Minister, I declare the fall of the regime and the placing of its leader in a safe place following his arrest.
After 3 decades of rule under Omar al-Bashir, Sudan's fate will once again be decided by the army. The defense minister announced the creation of a military council that would govern the country for the next 2 years.
Well, Anne-Laure May is a Sudan specialist at the USM Centre for Strategic Research, and she joins us now in the studio. Thank you for being with us on France 24. Now,
thank you.
Just to put this in a bit of a regional context, we saw so many dictators fall, didn't we, a few years ago during the so-called Arab Spring. Omar al-Bashir was one of the more brutal dictators. What took so long, do you think, for this to happen in Sudan?
Well, I think you have part of the answer, that it was a very brutal regime, very highly repressive. And for instance, in 2013, you also had another protest movement, and it was 200 people were dead the first day because the security forces just started shooting. So that's why it took so long. But also, for political transition, you actually need a sort of perfect storm of things to happen. So, and that's what happened right now with economic grievances, but also, of course, political grievances that are intrinsically connected. And also a sort of underground movement, the Sudanese Professional Association, that was there to actually organize the protest, to give, the word where to go, which day to go outside and to go and protest. So you needed a whole lot of different factors to finally arrive at this point, though I think talking about a transition is a little bit too early. For that.
Why is it too soon to talk about a transition? The army says it wants to oversee a 2-year period and then it will hold elections. You don't hold out much hope for that?
Yeah, I mean, what we have seen is that they actually overthrew Omar al-Bashir, but the man who is replacing, who is at the head of this transitionary council, is actually vice president. So it's really the same people that were already in the system. They just got rid of the symbolic head, but power has not changed hands, really. So we will have to see who exactly is in this council, and also what happens in the next few days and few weeks. Because many protesters actually are really angry at what happened, because they realize it's only a cosmetic change. It's not a deep change. It's not an overthrow of the whole system.
There are quite a few similarities with what has happened recently in Algeria. Again, a long-serving dictator overthrown, and demonstrators are really angry that the regime appears to be trying to cling onto power. Will the demonstrators accept that, or might we see the unrest continue?
I think tonight is going to be a crucial night. We'll see if people still go outside and if people respect the curfew that was announced by the army, and if actually there is a repression if people transgress this order. Because if there is a repression, it might actually get really violent, and it might actually, of course, people might go back home because it's beginning to be too dangerous. Or we'll see if the army is still sort of backing out and letting things happen. So I think tonight is going to be especially crucial to understand what's going to happen in the next few days and few weeks.
Okay, Anne-Laure May, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed, for joining us. Egypt, of course, as we just mentioned, also overthrew its dictator several years ago, the first country to do so during the so-called Arab Spring. We can go now to Cairo to see what reaction there has been there. Ruth Michelson is there. And Ruth, Fattah al-Sisi has already issued his support for the Sudanese people.
Well, yes, we saw a statement a few hours ago from the Egyptian Foreign Ministry. It did repeatedly state their support for the Sudanese people and what it termed as their choices and their aspirations. It said Egypt offers its full support for the brotherly Sudanese people's free will to shape the future of their country. Probably worth mentioning, given Egypt's own history and the military coup that took place here in 2013, that the statement also mentions support for the army. And it talked of the loyal national army helping the Sudanese people to overcome this critical stage.
What kind of relationship does Egypt have with Sudan?
Well, at times it's been a tempestuous relationship. Sudan, Omar al-Bashir had at one point accused Egypt of meddling in Sudanese affairs a few years ago, but the relationship had grown a lot closer over the years. And many times Omar al-Bashir had been front and center at prominent Egyptian events like the opening of the second Suez Canal channel in 2015. There'd also been increasing security cooperation between the Sudanese and Egyptian security services since around this time last year. And that actually also included a visit by the then defense minister and now acting interim leader, Awad Mohammed ibn Auf, who came to Cairo around this time last year.
Ruth Michelson in Cairo, thank you very much indeed. Well, these protests in Sudan began initially as a result of a hike in bread prices. Here to talk about the economic aspect to the current events is our business editor, Kate Moody. And Kate, you've been looking closely at Sudan's economy and to what extent economic mismanagement and the crisis there helped to fuel these protests and the eventual downfall of this dictator.
Absolutely. Well, as you said, the protests were really sparked by that hiking of bread prices. But in reality, shortages and soaring prices have been part of daily life in Sudan for years. Now, the value of the Sudanese pound did plunge 85% against the dollar last year, meaning that it buys much less. Prices have spiked dramatically. This is data from the International Monetary Fund. Its official inflation figure for this April is just under 50%, but other sources put it as high as 70%. And on the streets, it can be as much as double those figures. Now, about a fifth of Sudan's overall population is unemployed. The percentage is higher among young people, who make up about half of the population. There's a thriving black market, and the informal economy is really thought to account for about 60% of the country's GDP. Now, the government's hard currency reserves have been dropping. Last year, they imposed limits on daily withdrawals from banks and ATMs, sometimes just $11 per day. We saw lots of people queuing outside of banks at the end of last year. It did drive a lot more people in search of money, especially dollars, to the black market, where, of course, exchange rates fluctuate wildly. And that's really one of the issues, this lack of cash that has led people to accuse the government of economic mismanagement.
All right, so that is what's going on inside the country. But what about internationally? Where does Sudan's economy stand in the global economy?
Well, it's something of an international pariah, it has to be said. Oil is a very crucial resource. It brings in about half of government revenue. 95% of exports are oil. Now, the independence of South Sudan in 2011 was a real economic blow for the North. It controls about 75% of oil resources in the South. Crucially, the pipelines that are used to produce and export that oil. So you can see there's a real discrepancy there. And the drop in oil prices, of course, around the world also resulted in less money flowing in. Now, the country does export gold and livestock as well, but oil is really the crucial driver there. Sanctions have also played a role here, Laura. U.S. sanctions had been in place for around 20 years. They were lifted back in 2017. But Sudan is not a member of the World Trade Organization. It's in talks to try and join, but hasn't gotten there yet. And because it is still on Washington's list of state sponsors of terrorism, that means it's not actually eligible for either debt relief or funding from bodies like the IMF or World Bank. All of that, of course, discouraging foreign investment. Not many people see Sudan as an attractive place to do business.
Kate, thank you very much indeed. Kate Moody there.